Congressional Democrats are now calling for President Trump's removal from office following his extreme threats against Iran. They say the ceasefire isn't enough and are calling for Congress to rein in the Trump administration.
Well, a 2-week ceasefire is insufficient. We need a permanent end to Donald Trump's reckless war of choice. House Democrats have demanded that Speaker Mike Johnson immediately reconvene the House back into session so we can move a war powers.
There is something absolutely critical happening right now with Donald Trump in Congress, and it demands careful, honest attention, because there is a massive amount of confusion circulating online about what is actually happening versus what people are assuming, exaggerating, or projecting onto a situation that is genuinely complex and genuinely serious. Understanding the difference between what is real and what is speculative is not just an academic exercise. It is essential if you want a realistic picture of where things truly stand, what the actual risks are, what the actual opportunities are, and what role ordinary people can play in shaping what comes next.
President Donald J. Trump has been committing crimes since day one: bribery, corruption, taking power from Congress, creating an unlawful office in DOJ, violating First Amendment rights, ignoring due process, and finally refusing to abide by a unanimous Supreme Court ruling.
So let's walk through what is actually real right now. Specifically and concretely, multiple impeachment resolutions have been formally filed against Trump in the current Congress. These are not rumors. These are not speculation. They are official congressional documents that are part of the permanent public record. House Resolution 353 is the most comprehensive of these. It lays out 7 separate articles of impeachment, each one targeting a specific category of alleged misconduct. Article 1 charges obstruction of justice. Article 2 charges usurpation of Congress's appropriations power, which refers to the executive branch's alleged violation of the legislative branch's constitutional authority over federal spending.
These calls for removal because over 80 House Democrats have made social media posts saying that Trump's cabinet should invoke the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, declaring him unfit to serve, or Congress should impeach and convict him, or both. Now, multiple Democratic lawmakers have posted online saying that Trump has continued to decline, that he's not fit to leave, calling him unhinged or maniacal for threatening genocide. I also want to show you Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's post, where she says that this 2-week ceasefire, in fact, changes nothing.
When elected officials use the word tyranny in an official constitutional document to describe the conduct of a sitting president, that is historically significant, regardless of what happens next. That resolution exists. It is currently sitting in the Judiciary Committee. It lays out a detailed case for impeachment and removal. It is specific in its allegations. It is documented with evidence and citations. It is written in the formal legal language that Congress uses when it believes a president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, the constitutional standard for removal. This is not hypothetical. It is not performative. It is part of the official record, and it will remain part of the official record regardless of whether it ever comes to a vote.
Mr. President, I have been directed by the House of Representatives to inform the Senate the House has passed H-Res 798, a resolution appointing and authorizing managers for the impeachment trial of Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
The message will be received.
A few minutes ago, the Senate was notified that the House of Representatives is finally ready to proceed with their articles of impeachment. So by unanimous consent, we have just laid some of the groundwork.
Here is where it becomes essential to be very precise about the gap between what exists and what is happening. Impeachment resolutions exist. Calls for resignation exist. Constitutional mechanisms for removal exist. But none of those things automatically result in removal, and none of them are currently on a path that makes removal imminent. Filing a resolution is not the same as voting on it. Calling for resignation is not the same as enforcing removal. Having constitutional tools available does not mean those tools are being used or are about to be used. The existence of a mechanism and the activation of that mechanism are two entirely different things, and conflating them creates a false picture of the political reality.
And this deals with an involuntary transfer of power by the vice president and the cabinet deciding to meet and then saying that the president is unable to discharge the duties of his office. At that point, the vice president becomes the acting president, but, and this could very likely happen in this case, if we ever got to this point, which let's be clear, we're not going to, but then the president could say, actually, I'm fine. Thanks so much.
Trump has already been through this process not once, but twice. In 2019, he was impeached by the House for pressuring Ukraine to investigate a political rival, and the Senate acquitted him. In 2021, he was impeached by the House for inciting the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and the Senate acquitted him again. In both cases, Republican senators protected him despite extensive evidence and detailed argumentation because they calculated that defying Trump would be politically dangerous to their own careers and electoral prospects. The precedent set by those two acquittals is important context for evaluating what removal would require now.
I believe that the defense of Donald Trump will be that this is unconstitutional since he's no longer in office. But it really shows you how divided the Republican Party is over this trial. The Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, he's supporting the trial, but he has said that he doesn't know how he's going to vote. So will we see more Republicans vote to convict Donald Trump than during the first impeachment trial? Probably. Will we see 17 of them join the 50 Democrats? That looks very unlikely, at least for now, but things could still change, of course.
Those are the only two options under the Constitution, and both require a level of political alignment that simply does not currently exist. Republicans control the House of Representatives. Under current conditions and current leadership priorities, they are not going to bring impeachment resolutions to a vote. Even if Democrats were to force the issue procedurally, Republican leadership would use every available parliamentary tool to block it. And even in the hypothetical scenario where impeachment somehow passed the House, the Senate would still require 17 Republican senators to cross party lines and vote to convict. Under current conditions, that is extremely unlikely. The mathematics of removal are formidable, and they require extraordinary political shifts that have not yet occurred. The 25th Amendment scenario is even less likely in the current political environment. It would require Vice President J.D. Vance and a majority of Trump's cabinet to collectively declare him unfit for office. These are individuals whom Trump appointed specifically because of their demonstrated loyalty, and the idea that they would collectively destroy their own political futures by moving against him is not a realistic assessment of the situation, regardless of what Trump's conduct looks like from outside the administration. So the reality, stated plainly, is that removal is constitutionally possible, legally available, and politically blocked. Trump remains in office not because there is no evidence against him, not because the allegations are weak, and not because the constitutional mechanisms for removal do not exist. He remains in office because partisan loyalty among Republican officials currently outweighs constitutional accountability. That gap between what is documented and what is enforced is the single most important thing to understand about the current moment. This is where the real story actually is. Not emergency removal, not forced resignation, not a constitutional crisis producing an immediate resolution. The real story is a system under genuine and documented stress, with mechanisms in place and evidence on record, while political will lags significantly behind. What happens next depends entirely on whether that political will changes, and understanding the specific conditions that could change it is where analysis becomes practically useful rather than just descriptive. While removal is not happening right now, it is also not permanently off the table, and saying that is not wishful thinking. It is a historically grounded observation about how political conditions shift. There are specific factors that could change the political calculation very quickly, and those factors are not theoretical. They are rooted in how political actors actually behave, how power actually works in Washington, and what historical precedents show about when partisan loyalty breaks down. The first factor that could fundamentally change the situation is a dramatic shift in public opinion, specifically among Republican voters. Right now, Republican lawmakers fear Trump's political base more than they fear criticism for defending him. That fear is what keeps them in line. Their loyalty is not primarily ideological. It is a calculation of political survival. But if polling were to show overwhelming support for removal, including and especially among conservative and Republican-leaning voters, that calculation flips. At that point, defending Trump becomes the politically dangerous choice rather than the safe one. History is very clear that politicians follow survival instincts above almost all else. If protecting Trump were to threaten their careers more than opposing him, loyalty would disappear with startling speed. That is not cynicism. It is an accurate description of how political incentives work. The second factor that could change everything would be a precipitating event so severe and so undeniable that it breaks through partisan defenses. Not a slow accumulation of allegations that can be dismissed as partisan attacks or media bias. Not a drip of damaging stories that can each individually be explained away, but a single act or revelation so stark and so clear that even Trump's most devoted supporters cannot rationalize it or find a way to defend it. Clear criminal conduct documented on video, a national security catastrophe directly and unambiguously tied to decisions made by Trump personally, an abuse of power so egregious and so visible that denial collapses under its own weight. These moments are rare, but when they happen, they rewrite political reality almost overnight. That is precisely how Richard Nixon lost his political support during Watergate. It was not because the evidence existed in isolation. Evidence had existed for quite some time before his support collapsed. It was because the evidence became so visible and so impossible to ignore that the political cost of continued support exceeded the political cost of abandonment. When that threshold is crossed, things move very fast. Senior Republicans went to Nixon and told him to resign. And he did, because the alternative was removal by a Congress that had finally moved. The third factor is coordination among Republican officials. Individual defections accomplish very little and carry enormous personal risk. One senator breaking ranks gets targeted politically, fundraising dries up, primary challenges materialize. Two senators get isolated and punished. But if a critical mass of Republican officials moves together, the risk spreads across many individuals, and the cost per person drops dramatically. That is why leadership signals matter so much in these situations. Without signals from senior Republican figures that it is safe, or even necessary to abandon Trump, almost no one will be willing to go first. The first mover pays the highest price. But if that signal ever comes, if enough senior senators and party figures decide collectively that Trump has become a liability they can no longer afford, removal suddenly becomes politically viable in a way it simply is not right now. This dynamic is not about morality or principle in most cases. It is fundamentally about coordination and the collective management of political risk. The fourth factor is electoral change. The 2026 midterm elections matter enormously for this question. If Democrats retake control of the House of Representatives, impeachment becomes procedurally straightforward. Democrats would not need any Republican support to pass articles of impeachment through the House. That alone would fundamentally transform the political environment, even if conviction in the Senate remained unlikely given the two-thirds threshold. An impeachment vote forces every senator to go on record publicly. It dominates news cycles for weeks or months. It raises sustained political pressure across the country. It shifts donor behavior. It creates instability that makes continued defense of Trump far more costly for every Republican who provides it. The threat of impeachment, backed by the ability to actually execute it, changes the incentive structure in ways that make all the other pressure mechanisms more effective simultaneously. This is why claims about Trump refusing to resign or Congress voting for emergency removal, while emotionally satisfying, miss the real story. Those are end-stage scenarios. They only happen after political conditions have already shifted dramatically and irreversibly. Right now, we are earlier in that process. The foundation is being laid. The accusations are formally documented. The mechanisms are in place and understood by all parties. The pressure is building slowly but measurably. But the votes are not there yet, and pretending otherwise does not accelerate the process. It actually undermines it. by creating cycles of false expectation and disillusionment that exhaust and cynicalize people who would otherwise remain engaged. This gap between evidence and enforcement reveals something deeply troubling about the system itself that goes well beyond Donald Trump as an individual. The Constitution provides tools for accountability for very good historical reasons. Impeachment exists because the framers understood that executives could abuse power and that some mechanism for removal had to exist independent of elections. The 25th Amendment exists because circumstances arise where a president may be unable to perform their duties, and a clear process is needed. But tools accomplish nothing without people who are willing and able to use them. When a president can face detailed, formal, documented allegations of obstruction, corruption, abuse of power, and tyranny, filed by members of Congress in official constitutional documents, and still remain in office because his party refuses to act, that is not a failure of law. The law's functioning as written.